Sometimes the human mind rehearses tragedy, the way it rehearses traffic, as if imagining it is the same as preparing for it. A person clocks in like any other day. They answer emails. They refill the office mug. They think about lunch. Then, somewhere down the hall, something ignites. A copier, a trash can, a wire in a wall. The sprinklers don't help. The smoke moves faster than anyone expects, and suddenly there's a window, and there's heat, and there's distance below. Suddenly a person who has never once in their life thought about dying is doing the ugliest arithmetic imaginable. This way or that way. When we hear stories like that, stories where ordinary people are forced into impossible corners, we all ask the same question, even if we don't say it out loud. What would I do? Hold that question. Keep it somewhere in the back of your mind like a small stone in a pocket. Not because it's a fun question, because it's the only honest one. Because this story is about two friends who believed they were taking a simple detour into the desert. One night, a little adventure, something to break up a long drive, and then, almost without noticing, walked themselves into a place where the world stopped offering good choices. And as it unfolds, you'll feel it. That slow shift from inconvenience to worry, from worry to dread, from dread to the kind of thinking that doesn't feel like thinking at all, just survival, stripped down to its most brutal form. So again, quietly, privately, ask yourself, what would I do? At about 1:30 in the afternoon on August 8th, 1999, Park Ranger Lance Matson stood in the heat outside Carlsbad Caverns National Park and stared at a car that looked wrong simply because it had been still for too long. The vehicle, Massachusetts plates, dust filmed over its paint, sat in an otherwise empty lot like it had been abandoned by someone who meant to come right back. In the desert, time leaves clues. Dust settles. Sun bakes rubber. Silence gathers in the corners of things. And the longer Lance looked at it, the more the car began to feel less like a parked car and more like a marker. He knew the permit attached to that car. He knew the names on the paperwork because that was the point of the paperwork. Backcountry permits weren't just rules, they were threads. Thin lines of accountability stretched into country where people vanished all the time in small, stupid ways and in big, tragic ways. The two men who owned the car had filled out the forms at the visitor center days earlier. They had asked to go into Rattlesnake Canyon, one of the park's most isolated stretches, a narrow, scrubby route framed by canyon walls and heat. They'd been permitted for a short stay, a routine thing. Campers overstayed sometimes. One extra night, even two. A misread map, a late morning, a stubborn sense of we're fine, we'll be back. But this had gone on long enough that it stopped feeling like a delay and started feeling like a problem someone was going to have to own. Lance wasn't panicked yet, not even truly afraid. At first he was annoyed. Annoyance is a kind of armor. It keeps you from picturing the worst too early. It lets you tell yourself you're dealing with a nuisance, some inexperienced hikers who didn't take the rules seriously, rather than a situation where the desert has already begun its quiet work. He set off down the trail with a park volunteer beside him, the two of them moving away from the lot and into the kind of landscape that looks empty until you've had to search it. The trail toward Rattlesnake Canyon didn't feel dramatic. That was the thing. No cinematic cliffs, no obvious danger signs, just desert brush, pale rock, sky like a sheet of hammered metal. Heat pressed down with a steady, impersonal force. The canyon walls where they rose seemed to trap the air and send it back at you. They walked less than a mile when the volunteer nodded ahead. Just off the trail, pitched out in the open like someone hadn't bothered to hide it, sat a green and maroon tent. Lance felt that immediate swing of emotion that searchers know too well. The shift from irritation to relief. Good. Easy. Simple. A quick talk, a lecture about permits, then escort them out, or have them fill out the proper extension paperwork if they were determined to stay longer. They stepped off the trail and headed toward the tent. And the closer they got, the more that relief began to fray. First came the smell, wrong, sharp, chemical, the kind of odor you get when something manufactured is burning instead of something natural. Not the clean sting of wood smoke, not the faint sweetness of sage. This was synthetic, ugly, lingering. Then they noticed the ground. Bits of charred trash were scattered around the campsite like the remains of a desperate idea. Melted fragments, blackened scraps, things that had been thrown into flame not for warmth, but for a purpose, then abandoned when that purpose failed. They stopped a few paces from the tent. The flap was closed, zipped shut, and something moved inside. Not frantic movement, not the obvious thrashing of an animal caught where it shouldn't be. Just motion, slow shifting, as if someone were repositioning themselves in a confined space with very little strength left to spare. No voice came from within. No cough, no greeting, no irritated, "Hey, don't do that." The volunteer looked at Lance, and Lance looked back. In that brief exchange was the private language of people who have walked into enough strange scenes to recognize the shape of one. The air felt heavier. Their pulse felt louder. Lance reached down and, almost on instinct, as if decisive action could outrun dread, unzipped the tent. He lifted the flap. And whatever he saw inside hit him so hard that the story in his mind split into two halves. Everything before that moment and everything after. 3 days earlier, on the morning of August 5th, 1999, David Coughlin woke inside that same green and maroon tent and smiled before he even sat up all the way. He could hear his best friend outside, Raffi Kodikian, moving around with the purposeful, familiar sounds of morning camp life. The scrape of something against rock, the soft clatter of supplies, the small domestic rhythm of a day starting. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful. Despite the heat already building in the air, despite the dry taste that seemed to settle on the tongue, the moment you opened your mouth in the desert. They were on what they'd been calling, half-jokingly, the trip of a lifetime. Less than a week earlier, they'd left Boston, pointing their car west and letting the highway roll out beneath them like a promise. They slept in cheap motels. They found campsites. They ate whatever was fast and available. They told each other the same old stories, because friends do that when they're trying to measure how far they've come. Their destination was California, a university in Santa Barbara, where David planned to begin graduate work. But the road trip was the point, too. A long, last stretch of youth before the next phase of life put its weight on them. And then, on August 4th, they reached Carlsbad Caverns National Park. Carlsbad was different from the small, crowded places they'd stayed before. It felt huge, wild, open, indifferent. Thousands of acres of desert. The kind of landscape that makes you feel small in a way that is, at first, thrilling. For two men used to desk work and city boundaries, crosswalks, schedules, predictable danger, this desert felt like freedom. Like the West they'd always imagined from movies and old stories. They got their backcountry permit and set off into Rattlesnake Canyon, carrying what they believed was enough for one night, a tent, a few supplies, and a notebook, something to document the adventure, to give the story a spine when they told it later. By the time David sat up that morning, sweat was already starting to gather on his skin. He reached for their water and took a drink. It didn't feel like much. At the visitor center, a ranger had emphasized the same thing again and again. In this heat, you needed a lot of water. A gallon per person per day. No exceptions, no bargaining, no bravado. The desert doesn't care how fit you are or how confident you feel. But Raffi had more outdoor experience, more comfort with the idea of roughing it. And after they left the counter, he'd waved off the warning. Too much. Overkill. They wouldn't be out that long. They had brought far less than recommended. Only a few small containers between them. They'd already used some the night before, not even out of carelessness, but out of normalcy. Cooking dinner. Because that's what you do when you camp. You make a meal and you laugh at the inconveniences, and you tell yourself it will make a good story. David wasn't panicked about it. Not yet. Their plan was simple. Hike back out that day. They'd pitched the tent close enough, they believed, that the walk to the car would be short. Get back to the lot, refill supplies, continue west. He capped the water, pulled himself out of his sleeping bag, and stepped into the morning light. Raffi was already up, doing what he always did, making movement look like control, like confidence. By 8:30 a.m., the campsite was packed. The tent was down. The desert had swallowed any sign they'd been there, except for the faint indentation of feet in dust. They started walking. For the first hour, it felt fine. They kept a steady pace, casual, talking. They found the trail markers, small stacks of pale rocks placed deliberately to keep hikers from wandering off into the scrub. The markers were comforting, little human fingerprints in an otherwise indifferent landscape. But after an hour, David expected something. The parking lot, the car, any sign of the world they'd left behind. Nothing appeared. Raffi shrugged it off. They were close. The lot had to be just ahead. The desert played tricks with distance. Canyon walls made the world feel folded. They stopped briefly, took small sips, then kept going. As the sun climbed, heat intensified into something physical. It wasn't just warmth, it was pressure. It felt like the air itself had weight. They walked another couple of hours. Still no lot. Worse, the rock stacks became fewer, then disappeared altogether. And at some point, without either of them being able to pinpoint exactly when, the trail stopped feeling like a trail and started feeling like just ground. They slowed. They looked around. They tried to remember what they'd seen behind them. Nothing looked familiar. A quiet kind of fear entered David's chest, small at first, like a cold coin dropped into warm water. They stopped. They sat down and pulled out a topographical map. The paper might as well have been written in another language. Lines swirled and bent, marking elevation changes that meant nothing to them. Canyons and ridges and gullies were there on paper. But on the ground, everything looked like the same harsh geometry. Neither man could translate those lines into certainty. The map, something they'd carried as proof of preparedness, became in their hands proof of how unprepared they truly were. They put it away. They stood up with the idea of continuing. Because what else could you do? But the moment they rose, exhaustion hit them like a tide. They walked to the edge of a canyon wall where a few stubborn shrubs clung to life and cast a thin, almost insulting strip of shade. They dropped into it without speaking. And in that silence, both of them understood at once what they hadn't wanted to say out loud. They did not have the supplies for this. Not the food, not the water, not the knowledge. The desert, which had felt like an adventure, began to feel like a trap. Then the sky changed. Clouds rolled in, dark, heavy, sudden. And for a brief stretch of time, rain fell in a downpour that felt like a miracle. They tilted their faces up and caught drops in their mouths. They licked moisture from rocks and leaves. They drank as carefully as starving people eat, slow, frantic, reverent. It wasn't much, but it was something. It restored just enough hope to make motion possible again. When the storm moved on, leaving behind damp rock and a smell of wet dust, they started walking. They walked for hours. The day folded into evening, and evening into night, and still the parking lot did not appear. Eventually, in the darkness, they admitted what their bodies already knew. They would have to camp again. They found a washed-out gully and set up the tent. The same green and maroon fabric, now less like shelter and more like a thin skin between them and whatever waited in the dark. They couldn't sleep. They sat outside and talked the way people talk when they're trying to keep panic from becoming prophecy. The rangers would notice. The permit was for one night. Someone would come looking. It was routine. But neither of them knew how quickly routine moved in a place this big. How long did it take before a missing permit became a missing person? And then, far off in the distance, David saw something. A pale sweep across the horizon, lights, moving like headlights, a road. Raffi saw it too. The effect was immediate. Hope flooded them so fast it felt like relief, like laughter, like salvation. All we have to do is reach that road. They crawled into the tent and fell asleep almost instantly, the way exhausted people do when they finally allow themselves to believe the next day will fix everything. They woke early and in the hard light of morning made a decision that felt responsible at the time. Instead of packing everything, they left the campsite behind, tent and gear, and wrote information down in the journal. Who they were, where they were from, how to find their families. A crude map of their position and the direction they intended to go. If rescuers came, the journal would speak for them. They set out toward the road. For hours they climbed, moving up a gradual incline, the desert opening wider around them with every step. Cactus tore at the landscape. Loose stone rolled underfoot. The sun climbed, and their mouths dried again into that thick, cottony thirst. Eventually they reached a ridge, a place where, in their minds, the world would finally make sense. They stood at the top, squinting into distance. No road, no strip of asphalt, no cars. No sign of the civilization they'd pictured so vividly the night before. Just desert sand, endlessly repeating, the horizon a hard line of emptiness. The lights, they realized, had been something else. A trick of distance, a mirage, a desperate brain turning ordinary glints into salvation. Above them, a bird, large patient, circled in slow, deliberate loops. It did not feel symbolic in the moment. It felt practical. Like the desert had already begun to plan for what came next. David wanted to turn back. Back to the tent. Back to the journal. Back to the place they'd marked, where rescuers might eventually reach them. Raffi insisted they keep going, just a little farther because giving up felt like choosing death. They walked a bit more. There was still nothing. Finally, they turned around. The hike back was worse because it wasn't fueled by hope now. It was fueled by resignation. They told themselves that when they returned to camp, there would be rangers waiting. There would be people, voices, water, the shape of rescue. But when they reached the campsite, it was untouched. The journal lay where they'd left it. No footprints, no disturbance, no sign that the world was looking for them yet. And with that, something in both men collapsed. Not dramatically, not with sobbing at first, but with the quiet internal snap of belief. The desert was not going to save them. By the next morning, Saturday, August 7th, they were deep into their 4th day in the canyon and running on the last thin edge of what their bodies could tolerate. Thirst does strange things. It makes you irritable. It makes time warp. It makes you think in short fragments because long thoughts require moisture you no longer have. They try to do what lost people are taught to do: make themselves visible. They began arranging rocks into an SOS on the ground, but the work was slow, brutal. Each stone felt heavier than it should. By the time they'd formed the first letters, they couldn't finish. Raffi attempted a smoke signal, burning something synthetic, something that produced a thick, ugly stench rather than a clean column. The smoke didn't rise the way they needed it to. It hung low, stubborn, as if the air itself refused to carry their plea. All it accomplished was turning their campsite into a place that smelled like burnt chemicals, an odor that clung to their clothes and made each breath feel tainted. By afternoon, the sun was directly overhead, crushing the landscape with brightness. They crawled into the tent because it was the only shade they had, and even that shade felt thin. The rocks beneath them held a faint coolness, so they altered the tent to lie directly on stone, trying to borrow relief from the earth. By dusk, the air finally loosened its grip. The sun slid behind the canyon rim, and the heat bled out of the rock the way breath leaves a lung, slow, reluctant, leaving behind a dry coolness that should have been relief. Instead, it felt like the world had simply changed tactics. Inside the tent, the stones under them held a faint chill. They had stripped away what little barrier there was between their bodies and the ground because the ground was the only thing that didn't burn. The nylon smelled wrong now, tainted by the day's failed fire, by melted fabric and gasoline, and the sour aftertaste of smoke that had never risen high enough to matter. David reached for the journal again, the way someone reaches for a railing in darkness. He wrote first, words meant for one person, pressed into paper with a hand that shook more from weakness than emotion. It was not poetic. It was not dramatic. It was the plain language of a man trying to be understood while there was still time to be understood. When he finished, he held the notebook out. Raffi took it. He stared at the page for a long time without writing, as if the act of choosing words felt like choosing outcomes. Then he put down his own message, shorter, harsher, the kind of note that reads like a vow because vows are easier than fear. When they were done, they tucked the journal away like a relic, like evidence, like a last witness that would outlive them. They crawled out of the tent. Night in the desert doesn't bring peace. It brings clarity. The sky turns black and sharp with stars, and the land feels so wide you can't imagine a human voice crossing it. Their breaths sounded too loud. Even their small movements felt like trespassing. They sat with their backs to rock, knees drawn up, and for a while they didn't talk. They just listened to their own bodies, dry throats, cramped stomachs, the faint tremor in muscles that had been asked to do too much on too little. Finally, Raffi said in a voice that didn't match the words, too calm, too controlled, as if he were describing a weather pattern. "We can't do another day." David's laugh came out broken, the wrong sound. Then it turned into something else, something rawer. It rose in him fast, not as a thought, but as a flood, and he covered his face with his hands like a child. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "They'll come," he said, but it sounded like a question. "They have to." Raffi stared out at the dark as if he could see the whole park laid flat in his mind. Visitor center, paperwork, the red Mazda in the lot, 2 signatures on a form, 2 men who were supposed to return. He shook his head once. Small. Final. "They don't know," he said. "Not yet." That was the worst thing about it, the "not yet." In a city, not yet means an ambulance is on the way. In the backcountry, not yet means you can slip off the schedule of the living without anyone noticing. David wiped his face. He looked older than he had 3 days ago. Not from sunburn, not from dirt, but from the way hope had been used up. And then he said it, not as a demand, not as drama, as a terrible kind of logic. "If we wait, we're going to go out there slow," he said, nodding toward the open dark beyond the tent, beyond the small ring of disturbed ground. "Or something comes, or we—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence because finishing it made it real. Raffi's eyes didn't leave the horizon, but his jaw tightened. David swallowed, then spoke again, quieter. "I can't—" Another stop. Another try. "I can't do that part." The desert had already taken most of what they owned: water, orientation, certainty. Now it was coming for something else, the right to die in a way that still felt like yourself. They argued, but it wasn't a fight. It was 2 exhausted minds pushing against a wall, looking for a door that wasn't there. Raffi kept returning to practicalities. Maybe a storm, maybe a plane, maybe tomorrow, and David kept returning to the same grim truth. Tomorrow is a gamble we can't afford. When David finally broke, when he began to sob with that thin, panicked sound of someone who has reached the edge, Raffi shifted closer, not to comfort him with promises, but to steady him with presence. Their shoulders touched. 2 friends reduced to the most basic human unit. Someone beside you so you don't disappear alone. Minutes passed. Then longer. At some point, David turned his head, looked directly at Raffi, and said the sentence that would never leave either of them. David's voice went small, almost polite. Like he was asking for a favor he hated himself for needing. "Raffi," he said, I can't do it to myself. Not here. Not like this." Raffi shook his head hard. "Don't." "Please," David whispered, eyes fixed on the dark, as if he couldn't bear to look at his friend while saying it. "If this is how it ends, I need it to be quick. I need it to be you. And then, after, don't let me be left out here." Raffi's throat worked. He looked like he was trying to swallow the entire canyon. "No," he said again, but it sounded weaker this time. David nodded once, like he'd already made peace with the answer he was pulling from him. "I'm asking you," he said, "as my friend." The word did something to the night. It changed the temperature between them. It made the air feel closer, the sky heavier. Raffi stared at the ground. His hands curled and uncurled in his lap. He was the one with more experience outdoors, the one who had sounded confident at the ranger desk, the one who had waved off the water warnings like they were suggestions meant for tourists. Now he looked like a man being asked to pay a bill with a currency he didn't have. David's voice was softer when he spoke again, almost gentle. "We tell ourselves it's for the families," he said. "We tell ourselves it's mercy." He swallowed, throat working painfully. "But really it's because I can't stand the waiting." Raffi's eyes lifted. In them was something that wasn't agreement, not yet, but the beginning of it. The moment when a person stops looking for a third option. They talked for a long time after that. Not about the desert, not about rescue, about childhood memories, about Boston, about the road trip and the dumb jokes they'd made at gas stations, about the university waiting in California like another lifetime, about how easy it had been in the beginning to feel invincible. And under all of it, the same question kept circling, tightening. How does a friend carry another friend out of a place like this? Near midnight, David said it one last time. Raffi didn't answer right away, but when he finally nodded, it wasn't peace. It was surrender. The kind that comes when the mind decides that the least impossible choice is still impossible, but it's the only one left. They stood. Their legs shook. Their bodies moved like machines running on fumes. They crawled back into the tent. Raffi pulled the zipper closed, and the canyon took the sound of them. The next morning, August 8th, Lance Matson and the volunteer walked toward the campsite and found it looking wrong in exactly the way it had looked wrong from a distance. The smell, the burned scraps, the silence. When Lance opened the tent, he found Raffi alive, but barely. His body had been reduced to something narrow and worn, his eyes too large in his face. He looked like a person who had been scraped down to the last layer of endurance. Raffi's first words were not dramatic. They were not a confession. They were a request so simple it felt like a child's. Water. Lance gave him water, carefully. The way you do when someone has been deprived for too long. The volunteer hovered close, scanning the area, looking for the second hiker. Because there had been 2 names on the permit, 2 friends, 2 lives. Lance asked where the other man was. Raffi lifted an arm, weak, almost casual, and pointed beyond the tent toward the canyon wall. At first, Lance saw nothing, just rock, scrub, light. He asked again, and Raffi pointed again with the same blank insistence, as if his body could no longer afford emotion. So Lance stood and followed the direction of that hand. A few steps away, he nearly stumbled over a small arrangement of rocks. Not random, intentional. The kind of thing you only build when you want something covered. A cold understanding moved up Lance's spine, an instinctive dread that arrives before the mind catches up. He knelt. He shifted one of the rocks. And underneath he found what Raffi had been pointing to. The proof that only one of them would walk out of Rattlesnake Canyon alive. The canyon, in that moment, became quieter than it had any right to be. Because silence in the desert is normal. But this was a different kind of silence. The kind that follows an irreversible act. Later, the story would be told and retold in courts and newspapers and conversations that began with disbelief and ended with the same question you've been holding since the beginning. What would I do? Raffi said he had killed his friend. He would describe it as mercy. Others would question what mercy meant when only one man survived to define it. What is known in hard dates is this. Months later, Raffi Kodikian pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. A judge sentenced him to a long term, but suspended most of it, leaving a comparatively short time to be served, followed by probation, an outcome that only intensified the debate over what the desert had done to their minds. And then there is the detail that lands like an insult when you hear it, because it doesn't change anything, and yet it changes how you feel about everything. Investigators later determined that the place where the 2 friends had been stranded was not impossibly far from safety, close enough that under different circumstances, they might have reached their car in a short walk. That fact doesn't erase the heat. It doesn't erase the thirst. It doesn't erase fear. It only adds a final, lingering residue to the tangible resolution. They were not killed by a monster. They were not hunted. They were not swallowed by some dramatic wilderness myth. They were undone by a sequence of ordinary human decisions: confidence, dismissal, a little pride, a misread landscape, until the desert cornered them into a night where unthinkable stopped being a word and became a plan. And that is the residue that remains even after the rescue, even after the sentencing, even after the world tries to file the story away under tragedy or crime. Not that the desert is cruel, but that the desert is indifferent. And in indifference, morality becomes fragile, thin as tent fabric, easy to tear when the heat is high enough and the water's gone. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.